Hey you, I'm Ali Ammo, and this is the Lease on Life podcast. Keeping in line with going through all of the most common cycles that we experience in each of the 8 fundamental elements in the Web of Life philosophy that I created. Today we're going into the other side of the foundation strand, relationships and environment. We covered relationships previously and we're talking about violence, and some of that will come up. So this is a bit of a trigger warning, but it won't be as deep as the last one in the relationship sector. So looking at toxic environments. I'm sure you know what a toxic environment is, but have you actually personally experienced one? Chances are the answers are yes. And again, I'm reading from my book, Detangling the Web of Life, the complete guide to understanding you and everyone else. Now we're looking at element 4, which I think is in chapter 6. Where was your toxic environment? Was it at home? Was it at school? At work? A combination? Unhealthy environments invade both your inner and outer worlds. So what you experienced outside was mirrored inside of you. What you saw, heard, and felt would immediately shift your mood. It's akin to living in a natural disaster zone, except these harsh living conditions can only be caused by other humans. The impacts on you are just as rapid and extreme as the worst events on Earth, and they can be just as deadly. Sadly, some people prefer to take their own life rather than continue to subject themselves to the torment. A toxic environment is like living in a tornado. It's a whirlwind of emotional devastation and mental destruction. Meanwhile, you're in constant anticipation of the inevitable volcanic eruptions that vary in proportion. You're also fearful of the magnitude of the next earthquake because you're still being hit by the tsunami waves from the last one. Those waves of hurt, dread, and defeat are relentless. It doesn't matter where the toxic environment is, you experience the hurt, the dread, and that defeat feeling. If it's a work thing, come Monday morning, you experience all of that. You feel the pain before it happens. You feel the dread of what could possibly happen, or the aftershocks coming from what happened in the previous week. And it can be defeating before you even enter the zone. Just thinking about what's to come will send aftershocks through your entire body. If it sounds difficult and dangerous to escape, that's because it is. Though some people are stuck in a vicious cycle where they go from one toxic relationship to another, it actually requires a cycle of its own to function. Violence is one of the most common, and unfortunately, this can also be generational. You may have personally experienced this cycle, or you know someone that has. It's a trauma endured by many people around the world. Just in Australia alone, 2.5 million adults have declared that they experienced physical abuse during their childhood. When I met Anastasia, I discovered why this environmental cycle is repeated so easily by the next generation. Anastasia was raised in a household with domestic and family violence. It was never talked about or shared with others, so each family member was left to their own devices to cope. This meant that as a child, she learned to function within the dysfunction. So she got comfortable with chaos, and violence was normalized. It was a part of family life. The infliction of this cycle was enough for her to allow it to continue into her intimate relationships as an adult. Although she hated this part of her childhood and resented her mother for staying in the relationship, she could never bring herself to leave violent men. She believed violence was a normal part of conflict in relationships, so she was quick to accept it. In fact, she'd almost come to expect it. Once this cycle began with a new partner, those that she created to cope in her childhood would naturally take over. The main one was the cycle of appearances, which I talked about in a previous episode. As the violence was kept a family secret, her instinct was to hide the truth and pretend her relationship was happy and healthy. But to enable the cycle of violence to continue in her relationship, other cycles had to revolve too. In Anastasia's case, her partner pushed her cycle of unworthiness to surface. Though she'd started to break it a year earlier, her partner was able to reverse her hard work rather quickly. With a conscious effort, perhaps she could have stopped the old cycle from going full circle again, but it's extremely difficult to override it when someone else is forcing its repetition. Like many stuck in this cycle, she wanted to stay in the relationship. She just wanted the violence to stop. The problem is that apologies and promises will always be made, whereas the changes that are needed won't. Detangling their web shows you how they became the person that they are and why they do what they do. Although it doesn't justify their behavior, understanding their cycles will give you the greatest chance to support them in breaking it. That is, if they want to. Now, it's important to say this directly and emphatically. You cannot break a cycle for another person. I'll say it again. You cannot break a cycle for another person. It takes courage, dedication, vulnerability, and true strength. At best, you can be their sidekick, but only if they're willing and committed to being their own superhero. Toxic relationships are cyclical in nature, but they can be a cycle in and of itself. And some people obviously bounce from one to another. Me personally, the toxic cycle that I was in the environmental sector was at work. I was actually a teacher when it happened. And the toxic environment was being caused by other teachers and management. This is not uncommon in Australia and around the world, but unfortunately, there are multiple components. And when you understand how all the components in the cycle operate and then understand how individuals function within it, that sort of explains how it comes into existence and repetition. You know how you have children in school and the kids will start like a dobbing war. They want to tell on each other for everything and that whole tattletale thing. And it's something that you don't want to continue. You want to encourage individuals to own up to their own mistakes because you want adults who can take accountability and responsibility. Funnily enough, the toxic environment part of that cycle was mostly one individual teacher who was telling on other teachers for things and would not know the story, say, for example, but her interpretation became what she would express to management. And then the school bully, who was in management and also something called a grievance officer. So if you have an issue with something or someone in the school environment, that's the person you go to for conflict resolution and to deal with it. It's like the HR equivalent. But the person who was in that role was actually the school bully and was best friends with the principal. So it sort of created more toxicity because you couldn't go to anyone of management or of an executive position to be able to reconcile the issue. And whenever the issue was somewhat addressed, it would be shut down, it would be dismissed. And so we had this whole clique situation. And that tends to be the case when there are toxic work environment situations. You have people who are part of the toxicity overtly, we'd say, and then there are people who are covertly part of the toxicity and they kind of play both sides. And then you have the series of people who are not part of it actively, but are actively participating in it, if that makes sense. So it's like, you know, that saying, true evil exists when good people do nothing. These are the people who can't do anything about it or have tried and failed at being able to do something about it, and they've kind of given up and they're aware of it and they talk about it, and some people will be in the middle with them and then go back and tell, and it sort of becomes part of the issue. And in a work situation, when there's a toxic work environment, it all boils down to one thing. There is a lack of self-awareness in leadership. When I say leadership though, you can be the leader of your family, your friends group, a workplace relationship group. You can be the leader of management or a sector of management. It doesn't matter what the situation is. There's also a leader in intimate relationships. With your closest friend or your partner, there's always someone who takes the lead. So when I say leadership, don't just think business, but the single greatest contributing factor to toxic environments is a lack of self-awareness within leadership. And if you go over the stats for what the impacts are of low self-awareness in leadership, all of it aligns with the same results that you get in a toxic work environment. So what tends to happen? There are high turnover rates. There's low productivity, low attendance. Job satisfaction is extremely low. The people in power have very high opinions of themselves and don't factor in any negative feedback, or they don't agree with it. They don't see it within themselves, whereas everybody else can paint the picture for you. And this is why relationships are a gauntlet. It's beautiful and it's terrible at the same time. You don't see things within yourself as clearly as people who are seeing you see it. They are your mirror. They get to reflect back to you what you are, how you are, why you do certain things. They can see it clear as day, but you can't see it even when it's right in front of your face. You don't want to look at yourself. Your ego cannot face the truth about yourself. And then that keeps you with low self-awareness. You do not develop it in any way, shape, or form because your ego is resisting that urge. And that keeps toxic environments continuing. Now, when it comes to family relationships and family dynamics, this is something that I wanted to understand personally, not because I experienced it, but because I wanted to experience it. Hang on a minute. That's not true. I did experience aspects of violence in the family home and those kinds of dynamics, but not nearly on the level of Anastasia, for example. But it's not something that my generation coming up are repeating as much when you have my level of violence in the home. It's a different story, though, for people like Anastasia, and I wanted to understand that. This is controversial, what I'm about to say, and I'm not negating the difficulty in being someone who's stuck in a relationship with domestic and family violence. But there's like the silent sufferer in that experience. When you are close to someone who is stuck in this cycle in their family life, and it's them participating in the violence themselves, it's really difficult to be close to someone who's stuck in it because you can't save them, you can't get them to see, you can't really help them. It comes down to themselves ultimately. And you can see plain as day that the form and function of that cycle depends on their level of self-worth, their level of self-confidence, their self-esteem. And in that journey, you see their confidence, their self-esteem, and their worth taking hit after hit after hit. And it can be verbally, it can be emotionally, it can be psychologically. Then there's the whole coercive control stuff that goes on. But ultimately, when there is violence, you're automatically going to have a lot of verbal abuse. And although it is quite common for people to hide that information, it is also quite difficult for them to share that information. And it's even more difficult when you have access and you're being told this information and there's nothing you can do about it. But ultimately what it comes down to is that individual. There really is nothing you can do but hold space for that person to share what they want to share and try to support them as best as you can and not try to get emotionally involved. Part of that cycle is that whole make-up breakup situation. Some people stay indefinitely, and there are people that I've known who've gone through long-term marriages that are still ongoing with multiple children and everything, and it's just part of their cycle, but they stay together. There's also the side that make-up and breakup is a part of the cycle itself. You really want to be happy when the breakup situation happens because they're realizing their self-worth, they're building their self-esteem, they're growing in their confidence. So when that cycle goes full circle and they get back together and it starts again, it's really difficult because you know they've betrayed themselves first and foremost, but it also can feel like a personal betrayal because you invested so much in them, you gave them a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort to help them get to that point, and then it's starting again. So I've learned to give distance when people are stuck in these cycles because You can lead the horse to water, you can't make them drink. And until their awareness of the cycle stops them from actively participating in it enough to passively spectate and recognize when the cycle is repeating. Because this is the thing with toxic environments, no matter the circumstance, I'll take it back to work. Sometimes they do have a bit of a major crisis situation where things are pointed out, plain as day, steps are made to break the cycle. For example, people start changing their behaviors somewhat, and you start to experience changes that signify growth. And you get your hopes up. And then, inevitably, over time, the cycle starts repeating again. How quickly you can realize that and then not continue your old cycle where you sit back and do nothing, you keep bringing that to attention so that things can continue in the way that they were going and not fall back into old cycles. But that is the problem. That old cycle has built so much force and momentum over time. It is just so much easier for that cycle to go full circle and repeat again than it is for the new cycle to keep going. So as soon as you let your guard down and become complacent in any way, shape, or form, it's going to repeat again. The beauty is you're not guaranteed to be stuck in a toxic environment forever. The difference is you. If this is you right now, no matter what the nature of the circumstance is, the most important thing you can do to start making the change is to develop your awareness. Understand how that cycle operates. What are the three components? If you know how the cycle forms, you have the experience, which gives you the knowledge. The knowledge is then integrated, and the integration is expressed. So you've got your emotional component, your mental component, and the physical components. You need to be able to recognize your cycle within, first and foremost. That's the main aspect of the whole cycle that you have the ability to change. So you need to know what your emotional cycle looks like, feels like, sounds like, which brings in the mental, what goes through your mind. You need to be aware of what emotions come up when things are repeating around you, where that is in your body, what those sensations are, and what emotions are attached to those sensations, what the thought train is that are attached to those emotions. So as soon as something happens, say at work, and you get those same rush of feelings and sensations that you did in the past, instead of just going straight into the thought train, and then the cycle spirals within you until you have to tell somebody or you have to do something or you retreat, however you physically express the cycle, because you are a part of it. It requires you to function in a toxic environment, regardless of where you are in that equation. But knowing how the cycle operates for you is the most important thing you can do. And it always starts with the emotional component followed by the mental. So understand what your thought train is. Just pay attention to it, maybe for the first time. Start to follow all the carriages, all of the windows in each of the carriages in your thought train. What is in the window? Who are those people? What do they sound like? What are they saying? What's it saying in your head? You need to know how that cycle operates inside you. Consider how you react or respond, how that cycle would be expressed physically for you. What would you say? What would you do? What would you not say? What would you not do? Because once you develop awareness of that, you can understand how you are actively participating in the cycle, but you are passively spectating and understanding how that cycle operates inside you and how it makes you function when it is in operation. That's when you can start to break the cycle. I haven't gone into this yet, but I will in a future episode. I have used the formula for cycle breaking in a relationship with somebody else that was extraordinarily toxic, and I've been able to break it unbeknownst to the other person. It took time and I followed the formula, but it didn't take as long as I thought it would, and our relationship is in a completely different place because of it, and the conflict and all the toxic stuff that used to happen doesn't happen anymore. And that doesn't mean she's changed some of those toxic traits. When the narcissist is narcissisting, I already have awareness of what that cycle looks like within me, and I recognize the emotion when it pops up, and I don't always do it as effectively as I used to, because over time it's like more hits keep coming. But the way I express that cycle personally now is very different. So things never escalate into a conflict. I'm working on giving nothing in response or flipping the script. Attention off me, attention on her, that side of things. But our relationship isn't what it was before. And it took time, but I understood how I repeated the cycle, which allowed the toxic relationship to continue. So it's not impossible. It is definitely possible. It just takes work. And as always, the work starts with you. So thanks for being here with me for this ep. New ones will come out to you every other Thursday. If you are located in Melbourne, I will be speaking at the Speakers Lounge at the Mind Body Spirit Festival on Friday the 4th of June, 4:45. And that's at the Melbourne Convention Centre. So if you want to come down, you can see me speak live and get a copy of the book. And I always give away a few freebies. Otherwise, if you want to join me on the 12th of June, the link will be in the show notes. And that is to break a cycle in 2025. If you'd like to get your copy of the complete Web of Life philosophy totally free, just head to my website, www.weboflife.au. You take it easy, beautiful people. You'll hear from me soon.